They thought they had arrested an ordinary man. In front of his wife and daughters, the police handcuffed Chuck Norris, humiliating him in front of the crowd. But within minutes, their mistake turned into a huge scandal that changed their fate forever. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you are watching this video. The road stretched out before them like a ribbon of fading gold, the sun sinking low on the horizon and turning the sky into a canvas painted with fire. Chuck Norris sat behind the wheel of his old pickup, one hand steady on the wheel, the other resting casually on the door. The engine hummed in a steady rhythm, a familiar sound that made long drives feel almost meditative. Beside him in the passenger seat was his wife Gina, her soft smile carrying both warmth and the subtle weariness of the day. In the back seat, their daughters Dina and Dana Lee leaned toward each other, whispering about the speeches and ceremonies they had just left behind at the Veterans Gathering. The ceremony had been like many others Chuck had attended over the years, faces lined with respect, voices hushed when he stepped up to speak, hands that clapped and patted his back in gratitude. He had accepted it with his usual humility, though inside he always wondered if the world truly understood the weight of sacrifice behind each uniform. His daughters had teased him afterward, saying he had made half the audience cry when he spoke about the meaning of service. He had laughed with them, though there was something solemn in his eyes as he looked out across the rows of old soldiers, some walking with canes, others sitting silently, their medals pinned proudly to their chests. The air in the truck carried that sense of afterglow, a peace that comes after a day full of honor, but also the reminder of how fleeting respect can be. Dina had pressed her forehead against the window, pointing out the changing colors of the sky. "It looks like the world's on fire out there," she said. Chuck chuckled softly. "That's Texas for you, a sunset that looks like it's ready for a showdown." Gina turned toward him with that familiar expression, part amusement, part worry. She saw the lines on his face, the subtle heaviness in his movements. Time had added its mark, but the strength beneath it was still there, coiled and quiet, waiting. "Do you want to stop for a drink before we get home?" Gina asked, her voice cutting into the silence of the drive. Chuck nodded, glancing at the fuel gauge. "Yeah, might as well. There's that little gas station in town up ahead. Girls might want a snack too." At the mention of snacks, Dana Lee sat up straighter, a grin spreading across her face. "Can I get chocolate, please?" Dina rolled her eyes but added, "And maybe some chips." Chuck smiled, the corners of his mouth lifting beneath his mustache. "All right, one stop before home. Don't raid the whole store, though." The neon glow of the gas station appeared like a beacon as they rolled down Maple Street, its flickering sign buzzing faintly in the encroaching dusk. The building was small, its glass windows reflecting the dying light of the sunset. A single car sat parked to the side, and a lone man pumped gas, his cap pulled low over his brow. Chuck pulled the truck into a spot, the tires crunching over gravel. The family stepped out, stretching their legs, and the air smelled of gasoline and hot asphalt, the lingering scent of summer heat clinging to everything. Inside, the cool blast of air conditioning greeted them, a welcome contrast to the heavy warmth outside. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, bathing the aisles in a sterile glow. The cashier, a young man with dark hair and tired eyes, looked up briefly before returning to the magazine he had been reading. Dina and Dana Lee immediately darted toward the shelves, their laughter soft and carefree as they debated over candy bars and chips. Gina wandered toward the refrigerated drinks, pulling out a bottle of water for herself. Chuck, meanwhile, walked slowly down the aisle toward the cooler, his boots making soft thuds against the tile floor. It was a simple moment, one that felt grounded in ordinary life. He picked up a bottle of water, cold against his palm, and studied it absently. He wore a shirt with his veteran insignia, a small reminder of his past that he carried with pride. A couple of other customers were inside as well. A woman browsing chips, a man scribbling lottery numbers at the counter. They glanced at him briefly, some with a flicker of recognition. Most people who met him in quiet places like this seemed caught between awe and disbelief, as if unsure whether the man before them could really be the same one they had seen in films or read about in military accounts. Chuck always handled it with grace, offering a polite nod or smile, never seeking attention. He didn't know it then, but the calm of that evening was about to splinter. The sound came first, tires screeching outside, loud enough to make the walls tremble slightly. The hum of casual conversation faltered. Through the glass, flashing red and blue lights cut into the dusk. Two police cars swung sharply into the lot, gravel spraying beneath their wheels. The suddenness of it made heads turn, and the cashier froze mid-page. Gina instinctively turned her head toward the noise, clutching her water tighter. The first officer stepped out of his car with deliberate speed, tall and lean, his jaw clenched tightly as though he had already made a judgment before even walking inside. The second officer followed, shorter and round, but with a swagger that carried arrogance. Their radios crackled faintly, but their hands rested near their holstered weapons, a gesture that wasn't necessary in the quiet setting of a corner store. Yet they walked as if entering hostile ground. They pushed open the glass door with force, the bell above it ringing harshly as it slammed against the frame. Conversation stopped altogether. The woman with chips lowered her bag. The man with lottery numbers stepped aside quickly. Dinah and Danilee, sensing something strange, paused in the candy aisle, their eyes wide. Gina's hand moved instinctively toward them, protective, though she didn't fully understand what was happening yet. "Out of the store, hands where I can see them," the taller officer barked. His voice cut through the silence like a blade. Every head turned toward Chuck. For a moment, Chuck felt the world slow down, the water bottle still cold in his hand. He blinked once, steady, his expression calm but puzzled. The shorter officer's eyes were locked on him too, narrowing as though they saw not a man, but a target already condemned. The air inside the small store shifted, tension rising like heat from pavement. People instinctively moved away, as though the very act of standing near him was dangerous. Chuck took a breath, set the bottle gently on the counter, and raised his hands. His voice was calm, steady, the same voice that had reassured men under fire, the same voice that had guided his daughters through childhood fears. "What's going on, officers?" But the calm only seemed to irritate them further. The tall one stepped forward, his jaw twitching. "You're under suspicion of impersonating military personnel," he declared, his words sharp and full of disdain. The world tilted slightly. For a brief second, Chuck thought he had misheard. Impersonating? Him? His medals, his service, his years of blood and sweat reduced to a false accusation, shouted in a gas station aisle. Gina gasped audibly, her hand tightening around the bottle until it crinkled. The girls stared, mouths open, unable to process what they were hearing. Chuck's eyes hardened, but his voice did not rise. "Excuse me? I am in the Army. I've served my country for decades." The shorter officer stepped in then, not to listen, but to act. His hand shot out, seizing Chuck's arm and twisting it behind his back with unnecessary force. The sharp click of metal echoed in the store as the first cuff snapped into place. The water bottle he had set on the counter rolled off, hitting the floor and spinning away until it clattered against the base of a shelf. "You're making a mistake," Chuck said, his voice still calm though firm. He could feel the eyes of every customer burning into his back, could sense the fear and confusion in his family. His words, however, fell on deaf ears. The taller officer smirked. "Yeah, they all say that." The scene was surreal. The calm of a quiet evening shattered, replaced by flashing lights, steel cuffs, and the heavy weight of injustice pressing down. As they pulled him toward the door, Dina cried out, "Dad!" And Gina tried to step forward only to be pushed back with a warning glare. Chuck caught his wife's eyes for a moment, a silent reassurance in the storm. Outside, the asphalt still held the heat of the day. They forced him down onto his knees on the sidewalk, the metal biting into his wrists. Cars slowed as they passed, curious eyes watching. Phones rose into the air, recording. The humiliation was complete, yet through it all, Chuck kept his back straight, his head lifted. He was not a man to be broken by handcuffs or by cruelty. The chapter of peace was over. Ahead lay a confrontation neither he nor his family could have imagined when they had pulled into that simple gas station for a bottle of water. The air outside the small store was thick with heat and tension. The late evening sun had nearly vanished beyond the rooftops, but the asphalt still radiated warmth, stinging the knees of Chuck Norris as he knelt on the sidewalk. The cuffs around his wrist pressed into his skin, cold and unyielding, while the flashing lights from the police cars painted the street in alternating streaks of red and blue. A small crowd had gathered, drawn by the spectacle of chaos breaking out in what had been, only moments before, an ordinary evening. Phones hovered in the air, their small black lenses capturing every second. Chuck felt their stares, but he did not bow his head. His eyes remained steady, his back straight, a soldier's posture even under humiliation. The taller officer, Harper, stood just a step away, his mouth curved into a smirk that revealed both satisfaction and arrogance. He leaned slightly, resting one hand on the butt of his gun, as though daring anyone to interfere. The shorter one, Simons, circled like a restless dog, glancing toward the crowd as if enjoying the attention. Chuck could sense that neither man wanted truth, only control. They had already cast him as guilty in their eyes, and now they were determined to put on a performance for everyone watching. "Look at him," Harper said loudly enough for the onlookers to hear. "All dressed up like he's some kind of hero. What are you trying to prove, old man? That you can still play soldier?" His voice dripped with disdain, every word chosen to sting. The crowd shifted uneasily. Some people lowered their phones, uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. Others kept filming, their faces unreadable behind their screens. Simons laughed harshly, stepping closer and tapping the badge on Chuck's chest with the end of his baton. "This look familiar to you? You buy it online? Maybe out of some surplus store? You think wearing this makes you somebody?" The blow wasn't hard, but it was humiliating. Chuck felt his wife's eyes on him, heard his daughter's muffled cries just behind the crowd. He wanted to reassure them, to tell them he was fine, but he kept his silence. The weight of the situation pressed on him, and he knew every word spoken, every gesture made, could be twisted against him. "I've served this country," Chuck said, his voice calm but carrying over the noise of traffic and murmurs. "You're making a mistake," Harper snorted. "That's what they all say. Every faker we haul in, same story. I'm a hero, I served my country. You think we're idiots? Apparently you don't need to think at all," Gina said sharply from the edge of the crowd. Her voice cracked with fury, but she stood tall, refusing to look away. Dina clung to her arm, her face pale with fear, while Danilee wiped at her tears, unable to understand how her father, her indestructible father, could be forced to kneel like a criminal. Harper turned his glare toward Gina. "Ma'am, step back unless you want to spend the night in cuffs too." His tone was not a warning, but a threat, and the crowd gasped at the casual cruelty of it. Gina froze, torn between rushing forward and protecting her daughters. She held them tighter, biting down words that would only provoke worse. Simons crouched low in front of Chuck, close enough that Chuck could see the sweat beading on the officer's forehead. "You like this, huh?" he hissed. "All these people watching? Your family seeing what you really are, a fraud? Bet you've been living off lies for years." His eyes gleamed with malice, searching for even the smallest reaction. Chuck met his stare without flinching. "If you believe that," he said evenly, "then you don't know what a soldier looks like." Simon's grin faltered, replaced by anger. He rose quickly, muttering something under his breath. The baton he carried tapped rhythmically against his leg as if itching to strike. Harper, still standing tall, decided to escalate the show. He turned to the crowd and raised his voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is what happens when you pretend to be something you're not. You disrespect the uniform, you disrespect every man and woman who actually served, and this," he gestured at Chuck, "is just another wannabe." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some looked at Chuck with doubt, others with sympathy, but no one dared intervene. A man holding his phone whispered to his friend, "That's Chuck Norris, isn't it? It looks like him." His friend shrugged nervously. "No way. That guy's a legend. Why would he be here?" Yet the doubt was enough to keep them frozen, unwilling to step forward against the badges and guns that radiated authority. Gina's voice cut through the noise again, trembling but strong. "That's my husband. He is no pretender. He's bled for this country while men like you hid behind desks." Her words earned gasps, some cheers, and a harsh scowl from Harper. He stepped toward her, his jaw set, but stopped when Chuck spoke again. "Leave her out of this," Chuck said, his tone low but commanding. For a moment, the authority in his voice silenced even Harper. It was the voice of a man used to being obeyed in the most dangerous of circumstances. But Harper shook it off. anger replacing hesitation. "You don't give orders here," he sneered. "You don't give orders to anyone." He motioned to Simons, who stepped closer, his baton raised slightly. The implication was clear. The children cried louder now, their voices breaking the stillness of the crowd. "Stop it!" Dina shouted. "He didn't do anything." Danilee sobbed, clutching her mother's hand. The pain in their voices made Chuck's chest tighten. He had endured combat, pain, and loss, but seeing his daughters frightened and powerless struck deeper than any weapon ever could. Still, he remained steady. Inside, anger simmered, but he knew patience was his ally. Every humiliation, every insult, every cruel laugh was fuel, but not yet fire. He remembered lessons drilled into him from his earliest days in training. Control yourself, because if you lose control, you lose the fight before it begins. Harper leaned down, close enough for Chuck to smell the acrid scent of coffee on his breath. "You think you're tough? Let's see how tough you are when those medals don't mean a damn thing. Let's see how tough you are when you're nothing but an old man in chains." The words echoed in Chuck's ears, not because they wounded him, but because they were so blind. These men saw only what was in front of them, an aging soldier, a target for their cruelty. They didn't see the decades of training, the battles fought, the discipline honed to perfection. They didn't see the family he had sworn to protect with every breath. Simon stepped behind him, shoving his shoulder. "Stand up. Let's take this somewhere else. We'll see if you're still calm when nobody's watching." The threat was clear. The mockery, the performance. None of it had been enough. They wanted more. Chuck rose slowly to his feet, the cuffs clinking as he moved. The crowd parted slightly, unsure whether to keep filming or to run. The eyes of his wife and daughters followed him, fear mixed with desperate hope. He gave them a look, brief but steady, a silent promise that he would endure, that this humiliation was not the end. As they began to lead him toward the patrol car, Harper glanced once more at the crowd, raising his voice so all could hear. "This is what happens when you play dress-up in a man's uniform. Remember that." His laughter followed, sharp and ugly, as the onlookers murmured in disbelief. Chuck said nothing. His silence was not defeat but preparation. Inside, the storm was gathering. And though the officers thought they had stripped him of his power, they had only set the stage for a reckoning they could not yet imagine. The evening that had begun with peace was now a theater of humiliation. But beneath the smirks and jeers, beneath the pain in his daughter's cries, Chuck carried the same unshakable truth he always had. He was not broken, he was not bowed. And when the moment came, they would understand the difference between cruelty and strength, between a badge and real honor. That moment was drawing closer with every mocking word. The silence that followed Harper's last mocking words seemed to stretch on endlessly, broken only by the distant hum of cars rolling past the gas station and the restless shifting of the crowd. The red and blue lights continued their relentless flashing, painting faces with alternating shades of accusation and doubt. Chuck stood now, still cuffed, his wrists pulled tightly behind him. He moved only as much as the grip on his arm would allow, his posture straight, his expression calm. But his calmness, instead of diffusing the tension, seemed to provoke the officers further. They wanted fear. They wanted him to break. They wanted him to validate the story they had already written in their minds, that he was nothing but a fraud dressed in honor he did not deserve. Simon shoved him toward the patrol car, the force unnecessary but intentional. Chuck stumbled a half step but quickly regained his balance. The onlookers shifted again, their murmurs growing louder. Some spoke in whispers, others openly debated whether they were really watching Chuck Norris being treated like a criminal. Most people were too stunned, too uncertain of the truth, to act. It was safer to record than to intervene, safer to shake their heads and step back than to confront men in uniform. "You hear me?" Harper's voice was sharp, loud, aimed not at Chuck, but at the audience. "This man's a liar. He's impersonating military personnel. That's a federal offense. You people should thank us for keeping your streets clean." "Clean?" Gina's voice cut through the din, trembling with fury. "You call this clean? You're dragging a decorated soldier in front of his children, humiliating him like a criminal, without a shred of proof." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, daring them to deny her. Dina clung to her arm, her wide eyes shimmering with tears, while Donnelly buried her face against her mother's side. Harper sneered. Proof? We don't need proof when the evidence is right in front of us. He jabbed a finger at Chuck's chest. That uniform, those badges, you think you can walk around flaunting that? You think you can trick people into thinking you're something you're not? Chuck lifted his chin slightly, the muscles in his jaw tightening. His voice remained steady, unshaken. Ask for my identification. Check my service record. You'll see the truth. But Harper waved a dismissive hand, as though swatting away an insect. We don't play games with liars. We know your type. You buy a few patches, sew them on, and suddenly you're a hero. That doesn't work here. Simons chimed in, his tone mocking. Yeah, next thing you'll be telling us, you saved the world in some action movie. He laughed loudly at his own joke, a grating sound that made several in the crowd flinch. I told you already, Chuck replied, his gaze unwavering. I served my country. I'm not pretending. I'm not lying. Simons leaned in close, his lips twisting into a cruel grin. Funny thing about liars, they all sound exactly like you. Calm, confident, oh so righteous, until they're behind bars and suddenly not so tough anymore. The words stung not because they carried truth, but because of the venom laced within them, the deliberate attempt to break him in front of his family, to strip away his dignity. Chuck closed his eyes for a brief second, drawing a steadying breath. In that moment he remembered the chaos of combat zones, the shouts of men under fire, the smoke and fire of battles where discipline was the only shield against fear. This was different, yet the same. These men sought to shake him, but he would not yield. From the edge of the crowd, a man's voice rose. That's Chuck Norris, man. That's not some faker. His words rippled through the people around him, some nodding in agreement, others uncertain. Harper turned sharply toward the voice, his glare sharp enough to silence the man instantly. The badge, the gun, the authority. They were weapons as much as the batons at their sides. No one else spoke up after that. Harper returned his attention to Chuck. Even if you were who you say you are, that doesn't put you above the law. You walk around in that uniform, you better be ready to prove it. And until you do, you're nothing but a criminal to me. Chuck felt Simons shove him again, harder this time, the edge of the patrol car pressing against his hip. Move, the officer barked. We're done talking. I'm not resisting, Chuck said, his voice still calm. But I'll tell you this. Someday, when the truth comes out, you'll regret the way you've treated me. Simons laughed, cruel and sharp. Truth? The truth is whatever we say it is. He tightened his grip on Chuck's arm and pushed again, forcing him to lean forward against the metal of the car. The cuffs dug deeper into his wrists, biting into the skin. Gina's voice cracked, filled with desperation. Please, he's telling you the truth. Just check his identification. Why won't you listen? Harper turned his cold stare on her once more. Because liars always come with a story, and you're just part of his cover. You should be ashamed, helping him keep up the act. Gina gasped as if struck. Her daughters looked up at her, their faces confused and frightened. Chuck's heart twisted at the sight, but he forced himself to keep his eyes forward. He couldn't let his rage break free. Not yet. The pressure continued to mount. The crowd's murmurs grew. Phones stayed raised, but no one moved forward. Harper's words cut deeper, not just aimed at Chuck, but at the family who stood watching. Every insult was meant to erode their faith, to make them doubt the man they loved. But Gina didn't waver. She lifted her chin and shouted so all could hear. This is my husband, Chuck Norris. He has served this country with honor. You're humiliating him because you're too blind to see the truth. For a moment, silence. Even the officers faltered, the name striking them like a stone thrown into still water. Recognition flickered in their eyes, but pride and arrogance would not let them admit it. Simons shook his head quickly, his denial loud. Names mean nothing. Legends mean nothing. He's just another liar until we prove otherwise. Chuck turned his head slightly, meeting his wife's gaze. He gave her the smallest nod, a silent signal to hold firm. He had endured worse. He could endure this, but inside a storm was building. He knew how quickly words could turn into something more dangerous. He could see it in Simon's restless movements, in Harper's clenched jaw. They were not content with mockery. They wanted escalation. They wanted dominance. And soon they would take it further. The evening had begun with insults and accusations, with cruel words thrown like stones. But Chuck could feel the shift in the air, the moment when humiliation alone would no longer satisfy them. He braced himself, not out of fear, but out of the knowledge that the storm was coming. And when it broke, there would be no turning back. The last of Harper's words still echoed in the night air when the balance shifted from insult to something darker. Chuck remained pressed against the side of the patrol car, the cuffs biting into his wrists, the steel cold and unyielding. The taunts, the accusations, the jeers, they had all been heavy enough to bear. But the look in the officer's eyes told him they were done with words. They wanted more than humiliation. They wanted spectacle. Simon shoved him again, harder this time, the edge of the metal digging into Chuck's ribs. The officer leaned close to his ear, his breath sour with coffee and cigarettes. "You think this is bad? We're just getting started." He straightened, casting a glance toward Harper, whose smirk had widened into something uglier, a satisfaction that fed on cruelty. "Open the trunk," Harper ordered, his voice carrying across the crowd. He didn't lower it to hide from the people filming. In fact, he seemed to want them to hear, to watch, to believe the theater of dominance he was staging. Simons obeyed, popping the latch. The trunk creaked open, and from within, the unmistakable clatter of wood against metal rang out. When Simons drew out the first baseball bat, the crowd gasped. It gleamed faintly under the flashing lights, its surface worn smooth from use. A second bat followed, heavier, darker, the kind that carried with it not just the promise of sport, but the threat of something far more violent. Simons rested one on his shoulder, the casual way a man might carry a tool he intended to use. Harper grabbed the other and tested its weight with a short swing, the sound cutting through the tense silence like a whip crack. Gina's scream pierced the night. "Stop! What are you doing? He's done nothing to you!" Her voice was desperate, furious, but also terrified. She clutched Dina and Denny Lee tightly to her sides, her body a shield, though she knew it could not truly protect them from what was unfolding before their eyes. The girls cried openly now, their small voices breaking the hearts of some who watched, though none stepped forward. Harper ignored them. He paced slowly in front of Chuck, tapping the bat lightly against his open palm. "You know what the problem is with fakes like you?" he said, his tone conversational, almost lazy, but the menace beneath it was unmistakable. "You walk around like you've earned respect, like you deserve to be saluted, but respect is earned with pain. Maybe it's time you felt some." Chuck stood still, his body tense but his expression calm. He raised his head slightly, looking Harper directly in the eye. "If you think beating a man in handcuffs proves your strength," he said evenly, "then you've already lost." Simons barked a laugh. "Listen to him, still pretending he's some kind of philosopher. Let's see how calm he is when we knock those teeth out." He swung the bat in a wide arc, not yet striking, but close enough that the whoosh of air brushed past Chuck's ear. The crowd recoiled as one, some gasping, others whispering furiously into their phones as they streamed the scene live. A man's voice rose from the onlookers. "This is wrong. You can't do this." It was shaky but loud. Harper turned his head toward the voice, his glare silencing the man almost instantly. Authority radiated from him like a weapon, and no one else dared to speak again. Simon stepped closer, the bat resting lightly against Chuck's shoulder now, pressing just enough to make the message clear. "Bet you don't feel so tough now, do you? Bet your little girls are learning what kind of man you really are." Chuck's jaw tightened, his eyes flickering briefly toward his family. Dina's tear-streaked face, Danilly's trembling hands clutching at her mother's dress. Those images burned into him. His heart twisted at their fear, but he did not let the officer see weakness. He knew that to yield even for a moment was to give them victory. "I'm still standing," Chuck replied softly but firmly, "and I'll keep standing, no matter what you do." Harper's expression hardened. He lifted the bat higher, raising it above his shoulder as if preparing to swing. The movement was deliberate, slow enough for the crowd to understand exactly what was about to happen. Some people turned away, unable to watch. Others leaned forward, their phones trembling as they captured every frame. Gina screamed again. "Please, stop. He's telling the truth. He's my husband. He's Chuck Norris." Her voice broke on his name, and for the first time, a ripple of doubt passed through the onlookers. Whispers spread. Some recognized the face, the stance, the unmistakable presence, but Harper's pride was too inflamed to let him back down. "Chuck Norris, huh?" Harper sneered. "Another lie, another story. Doesn't matter who you say you are. Tonight, you learn respect." Simon stepped behind Chuck, gripping the cuffs and yanking them upward, forcing his arms painfully high on his back. The sharp bite of steel into flesh drew a grunt from Chuck, though he kept his face composed. Simons leaned in, his voice a low growl. "Nowhere to go, nowhere to run. You're ours." The crowd buzzed with tension. The flashing lights, the raised bats, the man in handcuffs. It was a scene that felt unreal, like a nightmare unfolding in slow motion. Yet for Chuck, the nightmare was clear, sharp, undeniable. He knew these men wouldn't stop at humiliation. They were poised to cross a line from which there would be no return, and still he did not beg. He did not plead. His silence was his weapon, his dignity unbroken. Every second he endured was another second that proved he was not theirs to conquer. Harper adjusted his grip on the bat. The first real swing was coming. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Gina's sobs, the children's cries, the whispers of the crowd all blended into one terrible silence. Chuck braced himself, not for the pain that he could endure, but for the moment that would follow, because he knew that sooner or later they would give him the opening he needed. And when that moment came, no bat, no badge, no cuffs would be enough to stop him. The storm had reached its breaking point, and the first strike was only heartbeats away. The night air seemed to thicken as Harper raised the bat higher, its shadow stretching across Chuck's face in the strobing glow of red and blue lights. For a moment, everything fell silent, except for the pounding of hearts and the faint hum of engines idling nearby. The crowd held its collective breath, unsure if they were about to witness brutality or something else entirely. Harper's jaw was clenched, his teeth grinding together, the satisfaction of dominance lighting his eyes. Simons pulled hard on the cuffs, forcing Chuck to bend forward slightly, leaving his ribs exposed, vulnerable to the swing about to come. Gina cried out again, her voice hoarse, breaking on every word. "Please stop. He's my husband. He's not lying. He's telling the truth. Don't do this in front of our children." Her cries only seemed to fuel Harper's determination. He wanted the fear, the pleading, the proof that he was the one in control. He wanted everyone to know that the man before him, stripped of freedom by steel cuffs, was powerless. But inside, Chuck was not powerless. He was coiled like a spring, every nerve alive, every muscle tense with preparation. He had been waiting, watching, calculating. He knew that sooner or later, arrogance would give him an opening. Harper was telegraphing his swing, raising the bat too high, stepping too close, showing too much of his weight forward. Simons was overconfident, yanking on the cuffs as if they were reins, forgetting that even a restrained man could strike back if given the chance. The bat came down, slicing through the air with a rush of sound. In that instant, time seemed to slow. Chuck twisted his body sharply, shifting his weight onto one leg, and the bat whistled past his ribs, striking nothing but air. At the same time, he drove his knee upward with explosive force, connecting squarely with Simon's stomach. The officer gasped, his breath leaving him in a sharp wheeze, and his grip on the cuffs slackened. Chuck spun with the momentum, using his shoulder and upper body like a battering ram, slamming into Harper's chest. The tall officer stumbled backward, his grip on the bat faltering as he crashed against the hood of the patrol car. The crowd erupted, gasps and shouts filling the air. Phones shook in trembling hands as they struggled to capture the sudden shift from victim to fighter. Gina's eyes widened with a mix of shock and fierce hope, her hands clutching the girls close as she whispered, "That's your father." Simons tried to recover, wheezing as he lifted his baton, but Chuck, still bound by cuffs, pivoted on his heel and lashed out with a sharp, precise kick. His boot connected with Simon's thigh just above the knee, and the shorter officer crumpled sideways with a groan, the baton clattering to the ground. Chuck followed with another strike, this time snapping his leg out in a controlled side kick that sent the baton skidding across the asphalt, out of reach. Harper growled in rage, regaining his footing and swinging the bat again, this time aiming for Chuck's head. But Chuck ducked low, the cuffs limiting his balance but not his instincts. He surged upward, slamming his shoulder into Harper's midsection, lifting him slightly off his feet before driving him down onto the hood of the car. The bat flew from Harper's hands, landing with a hollow clang on the pavement. Chuck pivoted again, spinning on one foot, and with a restrained but powerful strike, he delivered a backward kick that knocked Harper sprawling to the ground. The officers were stunned, winded, their arrogance shattered as quickly as the illusion of control they had wielded minutes before. Chuck stood over them, still cuffed, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. His eyes swept the crowd, who now erupted in cheers, applause, and cries of disbelief. What they had just witnessed was not a desperate man lashing out. It was precision, discipline, the artistry of a lifetime spent honing his body into a weapon even when bound. Simons, groaning, tried to push himself up on one elbow, spitting curses under his breath. "You, son of a—" Before he could finish, Chuck stepped forward and pressed his boot against the officer's shoulder, pinning him down with ease. Harper, clutching his ribs, struggled to rise as well, but his movements were slow, awkward, the confidence gone from his eyes. "You wanted to see how tough I was," Chuck said, his voice carrying clear and steady over the noise of the crowd. "Now you've seen. But understand this, I didn't fight back to hurt you. I fought back to stop you." His words were not shouted, yet they cut through the chaos with the authority of a man who had commanded respect on battlefields far harsher than this. From the edge of the crowd, a woman's voice cried out, "That's justice!" The words sparked a wave of agreement. People clapped, shouted, raised their phones higher. The tide had turned. The officers were no longer symbols of power. They were the ones subdued, the ones humbled before the eyes of the people. Gina rushed forward now, no longer held back by fear. She knelt beside Chuck, her hands trembling as she touched his arm, searching his face for injury. "Are you all right?" she whispered, though the tears streaming down her cheeks revealed both relief and awe. Chuck gave her a small nod, his expression softening only for her. "I'm fine. The girls? They're scared," she admitted, glancing back at their daughters who clung to each other, their wide eyes filled with both fear and pride. "But they saw." "That's enough," Chuck said quietly. He looked back at the two fallen officers, then at the crowd that had become his witness. "They saw what kind of men these are." Harper tried to protest, his voice rasping through his bruised chest. "You attacked officers. You'll—" Chuck stepped closer, towering over him despite the cuffs still binding his hands. His eyes were like steel, unwavering, unflinching. "No, I defended myself against abuse, and now the truth is out here, in front of everyone. No lie will cover it." The crowd roared again, their chants echoing across the parking lot. Phones captured every angle, every word, every detail. The power had shifted irrevocably, the myth of authority shattered by the reality of honor. Chuck remained standing tall, a soldier even in chains, his pride untouched. The fight was over, but the reckoning was only beginning. The roar of the crowd swelled as Harper and Simons lay sprawled on the ground, their breaths ragged, their pride shattered. Chuck stood above them, his hands still bound, his chest heaving, but his posture steady and unbroken. The flashing red and blue lights no longer seemed to belong to the officers who had arrived with arrogance. They now illuminated their downfall. The scene had turned on them, and the witnesses, once hesitant and uncertain, now erupted with energy. Voices rang out, overlapping in a chorus of disbelief and exhilaration. "He took them both down," someone shouted. "That's Chuck Norris," cried another, their voice trembling with excitement. Phones tilted upward, capturing every second, streaming the moment across the world. Gina rushed to Chuck's side, her hands trembling as they hovered over his shoulders, checking for bruises or blood. "Are you hurt?" she asked again, her voice cracking. Chuck turned his head slightly, offering her the faintest of smiles. I've been through worse. His eyes flicked briefly to his daughters, who stood in the protective circle of strangers now cheering. Dina's tears glistened in the flashing lights, but her chin was raised, pride beginning to outshine fear. Danilee clung to her sister, whispering something only she could hear, but her wide eyes were locked on her father, as if seeing him in a new way. Harper groaned, clutching his ribs as he tried to push himself upright. His smirk was gone, replaced with a grimace of pain and a flicker of humiliation. Simons rolled onto his side, coughing, his face flushed with rage and disbelief. You're going to regret this, he hissed, though the words sounded weak, stripped of the authority they once carried. Chuck stepped closer, his shadow falling over them. The only thing I regret, he said calmly, his voice steady and low enough that the crowd had to lean in to hear, is that you chose cruelty when you could have chosen respect. That's on you, not me. He straightened again, his presence filling the space, his dignity unbroken despite the cuffs still binding his wrists. The crowd responded with applause, the sound startling in its intensity. People clapped, cheered, shouted his name. Someone raised their phone high and yelled, "The world's going to see this!" Others echoed the sentiment, their voices rising into chants of, "Justice! Justice!" The energy shifted entirely. No longer was Chuck the accused, the humiliated. He was the man who had stood tall, who had defended himself with honor, even in chains. Gina squeezed his arm, tears still spilling freely. "They saw," she whispered fiercely. "Everyone saw." Chuck gave a single nod, his eyes scanning the faces around him. Ordinary people, families, travelers who had stopped for gas. Each of them had witnessed the truth. And in this age, truth spread faster than fire. In the distance, the sharp wail of sirens grew louder. The crowd parted instinctively as more police vehicles pulled into the station, their lights cutting through the night. Doors flew open and officers poured out, their hands ready on their holsters. But as they saw the scene, their fellow officers subdued on the ground, the man standing tall with his family by his side, the crowd erupting in chants, they hesitated. Authority was a fragile thing, and tonight it no longer belonged to badges or flashing lights. One officer approached cautiously, his eyes flicking between Chuck and the downed men. "What happened here?" he demanded, though his voice wavered under the weight of the crowd's gaze. Dozens of phones pointed at him, recording every syllable, every twitch of his face. The power dynamics had shifted, and he knew it. Before Chuck could answer, a voice rose from the crowd. "They tried to beat him. They brought out bats." Others chimed in, voices overlapping, furious, insistent. "He was in cuffs. They humiliated him in front of his family. He defended himself." The wave of testimony crashed against the new officers like a flood, overwhelming any attempt to impose order. Harper tried to rise again, his face twisted with desperation. "He attacked us," he croaked, clutching his chest. "We had to defend ourselves." The crowd roared in protest, drowning him out with boos and jeers. "Liar!" someone screamed. "We saw everything." Another voice shouted, "Check the videos. It's all on film." Phones waved in the air, proof gleaming in every lens. Simons, still gasping, tried to back his partner. "He's lying. He's a fraud." His words were cut short when a man in the crowd yelled, "Fraud? That's Chuck Norris, you idiot. The whole world knows who he is." Laughter broke out, harsh and mocking, directed now at the officers who had once wielded power like a weapon. The new officers exchanged uneasy glances. Their radios crackled with orders. Their eyes darted nervously to the crowd, but they did not move to strike, did not move to silence. The tide had turned too sharply, and they knew any wrong step would be immortalized in countless videos by morning. Gina stepped closer to her husband, her voice steady, though her hands still trembled. "It's over now," she whispered, though she wasn't entirely sure if she believed it. Chuck turned to her, his eyes softening as they met hers. "It's just beginning," he murmured. The officers on the ground were lifted by their fellow men, though not gently, their humiliation complete under the gaze of the crowd. Their badges gleamed faintly in the lights, symbols that had lost their power in the space of minutes. They avoided meeting Chuck's eyes, avoided looking at the family they had tried to break. A chant began somewhere in the back of the crowd and rolled forward like a wave. Respect! 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 The sound grew louder, filling the night, echoing off the walls of the small store and into the open air beyond. Chuck stood in the center of it all, a man in chains who had nonetheless reminded the world of what honor truly looked like. News crews arrived before the scene even settled. Vans screeched into the lot, reporters leaping out with cameras already rolling. Microphones pushed toward witnesses, voices shouted over one another, demanding answers, demanding quotes. Tell us what happened. Is that really Chuck Norris? Did they attack him? The spectacle had grown beyond the gas station. It was already a story racing through the veins of a nation. Chuck said nothing to the reporters. He kept his silence, his dignity, letting the truth speak through the people who had seen it with their own eyes. Gina held his arm, her strength a steady anchor, while his daughters pressed close, their fear tempered now by awe. The crowd, the cameras, the flashing lights, they all blurred together. What mattered was that the truth had been seen, captured, undeniable. The humiliation had been transformed into vindication, the attempted cruelty into a stage for justice. Chuck, still bound, still in the same chains meant to strip him of his power, had proven that no man could take his honor from him. And as the night stretched on, as the crowd refused to disperse, as chants of his name mixed with calls for justice, Chuck knew the consequences for Harper and Simons would not end here in this parking lot. Their downfall had only begun, and the world would carry the rest of it forward. The fight was over, but the echoes of it would ring louder than any blow they had tried to strike. The night at the gas station lingered in Chuck's mind long after the flashing lights had disappeared and the crowd had dispersed, though its echo was far from fading. By morning, the world had already seen what happened. Clips of the confrontation flooded every platform, from news channels to social media feeds, each video replaying the moment when two armed officers were humbled by a man bound in steel. The footage had spread faster than any rumor, cutting through doubt with the sharpness of truth. Commentators, journalists, ordinary citizens, all had something to say, and most of them agreed on one thing. What had been meant as a humiliation had turned into a revelation. The headlines came first. Veteran humiliated, then defends himself in handcuffs. Chuck Norris takes down two officers. Honor in chains. Each article carried not only the story, but the outrage. The reporters who had arrived late that night filled their segments with interviews from witnesses, their words clear and damning. They mocked him, they threatened him, and they would have beaten him if he hadn't defended himself, one man said firmly into a microphone. A woman added through tears, they did this in front of his family. His little girls were screaming. It was cruel, and it was wrong. By midday, the mayor of the city stood before cameras, her expression grave. What happened at Maple Street last night was unacceptable, she declared. Officers Harper and Simons have been relieved of duty effective immediately pending further investigation. This city will not tolerate abuse of power, racial profiling, or violence against those who serve and protect our country. On behalf of the people, I apologize to Sergeant Norris and his family. Her words rippled across the nation, but for Chuck, watching from the quiet of his home with Gina and the girls, it was not her apology that mattered most. It was the sight of his daughter's eyes, no longer clouded with fear, but shining with pride. See? Gina whispered as she sat beside him on the couch. The truth is louder than their lies. Chuck sipped his coffee slowly, the steam rising into the morning light. He nodded but said nothing. For him, justice was not in headlines or speeches, but in the knowledge that his daughters had seen what resilience looked like, that they understood dignity was not something anyone could strip away. The investigation into the officers moved swiftly. Internal affairs confirmed what the videos had already made undeniable. Witness after witness testified that Harper and Simons had escalated the situation without cause, that they had ignored Chuck's repeated offers to show identification, that they had humiliated him deliberately in front of his family. The baseball bats discovered in the trunk sealed the case. What had begun as arrogance had unraveled into disgrace, and the weight of public opinion crushed any attempt to rewrite the narrative. By the end of the week, both men were terminated, their badges revoked, their careers ended in the same spotlight they had once craved. When reporters asked Chuck for a statement, he declined interviews. "The truth is they're all ready," he told one persistent journalist who had managed to catch him outside his home. "I don't need to add to it." He didn't smile, didn't boast. He simply walked back inside, his quiet composure louder than any speech could have been. Yet 2 weeks later, an invitation arrived that he could not refuse. The city's police academy asked him to speak to their newest class of recruits. It was not an apology, not an attempt to erase what had happened, but an acknowledgement that they needed to learn from it. Gina urged him to accept. "If you don't, they'll forget too quickly," she said gently. "If you do, maybe you'll change something." Chuck agreed, not for himself, but for the ones who would wear the badge in years to come. The auditorium was full the day he arrived, rows of young men and women in uniform sitting stiffly, their faces a mixture of eagerness and unease. The story of Maple Street had reached every corner of their world, and the man they had seen in videos now stood before them in person. Chuck didn't bring notes, didn't carry a script. He walked slowly to the front, his footsteps measured, his presence filling the room. When he spoke, his voice was calm, steady, without flourish. "Before you put on a badge, remember something. Power doesn't make you right. A uniform doesn't make you honorable. What makes you both is how you treat the people who trust you." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. That night, 2 officers chose arrogance over respect. They forgot that the man they mocked was not their enemy. He was their brother, and their choices destroyed them. The recruits shifted, their eyes wide, their attention fixed. Chuck continued, "You'll meet people who challenge you, people who test you, people you don't understand. You can't choose who you face, but you can choose how you respond. Respect isn't weakness. Listening isn't surrender. And if you ever raise your hand against someone, ask yourself if it's because you must or because you want to. There's a difference. Don't forget it." Silence filled the hall when he finished. No one moved, no one spoke. Then slowly the recruits began to clap, their applause building until it filled the room. Chuck nodded once, acknowledging them, and stepped down from the stage. He had said what needed saying. The rest was theirs to carry. That evening, back at home, the world felt quieter. The girls played on the porch steps, their laughter mingling with the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. Gina brought out 2 glasses of sweet tea, setting one beside Chuck as he sat in his favorite chair, watching the sun dip low across the horizon. The sky glowed with the same fire-colored brilliance as the night it had all begun, but now it brought peace instead of dread. Chuck leaned back, sipping slowly, the weight of the past weeks easing from his shoulders. He didn't crave revenge, didn't dwell on humiliation. He had been vindicated not by force but by truth. What mattered most was here. His wife, his daughters, the home he had built with his own hands, the quiet dignity of knowing he had not broken when others tried to strip him down. Gina sat beside him, her hand finding his, her touch warm and steady. "It's over," she said softly. Chuck looked out at the fading light, the sky streaked with gold and crimson. He shook his head slightly, though his lips curved in the faintest of smiles. "Justice isn't over. It doesn't end. It's something you stand for every day, in every moment. Sometimes it's loud, sometimes it's quiet, but it's never finished." He squeezed her hand gently, his gaze turning to his daughters, who laughed freely now without fear. "Respect isn't a favor," he murmured. "It's a right, earned, not questioned, and no one can take that from us." The last of the sunlight dipped below the trees, casting long shadows across the porch. The world beyond would keep talking, keep remembering, keep learning. But for Chuck, the moment was enough. He had stood tall. He had endured. And in the end, he had shown what true honor looked like. If this story kept you hooked, don't just stop here. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss what's coming next. We've got more unbelievable stories waiting for you, each one more shocking than the last. Click on the next video right now and dive into another twist you won't see coming. And don't keep this moment to yourself. Share this video with your friends and let them experience it too. The more people watch, the more stories we'll bring to life.